Hello, class. Today we're going to take a look together at Chapter 20, Section 3, North American Prosperity. Oftentimes in the news today it's referred to as American exceptionalism and sort of acknowledging the fact that America is really the one lone superpower today in the world and how that has impacted world in the modern history and on to the future. As Christians, we look at how God is using the these events today in history of America's surprising uh, economic and military strength compared to the rest of the world. And so we see the biblical principles being unfolded as we study these events as well. So let's take a look at how the United States became that global superpower and also uh, our society, what has changed in our culture, and how we as Christians view that as well. Um, so those are some things we'll be looking at. Shortly after the Second World War, there was concern over uh, a movement towards communism even in our own country as the Soviet Union began strengthening itself with its space program and its military. And so there was concern in the Communist Party in America growing, and some tried to make sure that communism did not take hold in America. Most notably, Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, and therefore this term of weeding out the communists became called McCarthyism during that time period. Many people were suspected of having communist sympathies and were put on blacklists and, of course, traced by the FBI and so on. And it turned out there was several communists, particularly in the entertainment industry, in the music, in the movies, and so on. And so he did bring that to the attention of the American people. But eventually, after the hearings that were televised, McCarthy came off as too harsh, and Americans sort of distanced themselves from McCarthy at that time. But also throughout the 1950s and 60s, America began growing in prosperity. People began affording everybody a car, a washing machine, television, many of the common conveniences that we have today, and the economy was booming then under Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general of the Second World War, the main Allied commander. Some of the scientific advances too that changed life in America and then of course around the world were made by the scientists studying for the space race. So many of the products and the materials that we use today were developed either for the military or for the space program. Um, Also, as far as nuclear advances and military advances such as GPS satellites that we all depend on today were developed in the 1950s. Um, as far as relations with the rest of the world, we already covered the Cuban Missile Crisis and how JFK demanded those be removed, and then Khrushchev eventually backed down and then was pushed out by hardliners in the Soviet Union. So you recall we were on the brink of a nuclear standoff for a while there in 1963. So now as a superpower, we do have Navy and air bases all around the world in many countries in Europe and Asia, and we are the only country that can quickly strike and even take down a country within a matter of weeks and have mobile strike force available all the time. So the rest of the world currently depends on America to defend it from any hostile aggressions. So we also are the economic power that the rest of the world depends on for their economic well-being, particularly the Europeans. The economy has been down, and they're depending on America's strength to carry the day. We did become, in part of the Cold War, as we studied earlier, in some wars to stop communism in Korea and in Vietnam, which we'll cover more when we get to those units. And also more recently in Iraq, in 1991, the first war, when Kuwaiti, the small country of Kuwait, was taken over by Saddam Hussein for their oil. They requested a multinational force led by America to come and push them out, which we did in 1991. But Saddam Hussein was left in power at that time, and later on in 1993, a second war with Iraq toppled the Saddam Hussein regime, which we'll be talking about. Also, some of the other places we've reached into in the 1990s, in the Balkans, in Croatia, in a war in Bosnia and Kosovo. There were airstrikes to end the domination by Slobodan Milosevic and Rakan Karadzic. So those are some of the people we'll be talking about in successive units. So in the post-war, our economy boomed, and of course since then, since post-war, we've only had a few downturns, most notably in 2008 and 9, the economic downturn, the recession that many of you can recall that we are now working our way out of. And we also, just like the Europeans, have begun expanding our social programs, and our government, in fact, even lately with socialized medicine. And right now, however, we do enjoy unprecedented peace, prosperity, and unrivaled military power. And that's really, this is what we mean by American exceptionalism. Some of the other issues facing America in the post-war period was racial segregation in the South, predominantly in education, but as well as like on buses or in public places, there was racial segregation. Even that many years after the Civil War, there was still deep separation of race, particularly in the South. So those are some issues that our country had to work out. And during the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement began getting steam, particularly headed by Martin Luther King Jr., who was pushing for new civil rights legislation with the help of the President John F. Kennedy. However, he was assassinated, as you probably have heard, before these majority of the civil rights could be passed. So Lyndon B. Johnson took up the fight of civil rights, and many of the civil rights laws were passed and signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. So Martin Luther King Jr., who's well known today as a leader of that civil rights movement, organized many of the protests, the boycotts, and encouraged nonviolence. Now we as Christian people understand that treating other races differently based on race is wrong. The Bible does not support that, and neither should we. And many like to make Dr. Martin Luther King to be a hero, and when you do look into his life, he was not a good Christian example, but he was used to bring about some of these changes. Another thing was the changing of morals, recreational use of drugs, new emphasis on rock and roll, and changing of lifestyle became and a movement away from Christianity by the general populace began in the 1960s, known as the Woodstock generation. So we look to biblically that God in these last days has given people up to these types of sins. So we notice that this is another sign of those events coming. Equality also for women was fought for at that time in the workplace. Then we have Nixon, some of the protests there. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 to take a more conservative slant on our economics, called so-called Reaganomics. The trickle-down theory of giving tax breaks to the wealthy so that they could afford then to hire more people and the economy could boom. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, was then elected president for one term after that. So Reagan also is well noted for his military spending. The arms race buildup with the Soviet Union, which they eventually backed down, and then they fell apart because they couldn't sustain the military spending, as we talked about in that issue. Canada is again very similar to America in its economy, its outlook, although most Canadians do live on the border within 100 miles of America. 90% of the Canadians live in the further north is very sparsely populated, so they are under a lot of direct influence of America, obviously. The main trading partner, also obviously with such a large border, shared border. They do have a group of French speaking in the east that sometimes want separation, and sometimes the Canadians are not keen on being dominated by the United States and like to express that they too are an individual country. There's also a lot of cooperation with the Canadians, depending on who the Prime Minister is, some more liberal, some more conservative, and sometimes they work better with our United States President, and sometimes there is a bit of tension over natural resources, pollution, and other issues such as that.